Hi everyone, and welcome back to my channel. And if you're new here, it's nice to have you. Today is part 2 in our series of bread making. If you missed part 1, I'll put a link to that video in the description below. Part 2 consists of 6 essential things you need to know about before we dive into bread making. So today I want to talk about yeast, flour, measuring ingredients, kneading, proofing the dough, and last but not least, baking. I'll leave timestamps in the description below so that you can watch the sections that you want. But I suggest watching the whole video. Who knows? You might learn something new. So let's start off with yeast. Yeast is actually a living organism. And when it's activated, the yeast ferments the sugars in the flour, producing carbon dioxide. This is what makes your bread rise. The 3 most common forms of yeast are active dry yeast, instant yeast, and rapid rise yeast. They can easily be found in any grocery store, but they're different. They're not one and the same. Active dry yeast is actually dormant, and it needs to be activated by adding lukewarm water, about 110 degrees. This process is called blooming the yeast. Once you've added your water and the yeast together, give it a little stir. Let it sit for about 5 minutes and you'll notice it's going to start to foam. That's a good thing. It's activated. Instant dry yeast does not require blooming like active dry yeast does. You can add this yeast right to your dry ingredients. The particles of this yeast are a lot smaller so that when you do add water to your dry ingredients, it dissolves a lot easier. These 2 yeasts can be used interchangeably or substituted for one another, but my suggestion is use what the recipe calls for. I typically use active dry yeast. It's just a preference of mine, but as I said, the 2 can be substituted for each other. Rapid rise yeast, or quick rise yeast as it's referred to sometimes, is a form of instant yeast, but they're not the same thing. This yeast can be added right to your dry ingredients like instant dry, so no blooming is necessary. Rapid rise yeast is good for 1 good rise, not 2 or 3 rises like bread typically needs. So it's really not the right choice for making bread. This type of yeast would be good for things like a pizza dough. Let's move on to flour. What are the types of flour you can use for basic bread making? And what do those percentages mean on the bags? There are 4 types of flour that you can find easily in the grocery store that you can use for basic bread making. All-purpose flour, bread flour, whole wheat flour, and white whole wheat flour. The percentages found on the bags refer to the amount of protein content found in the flour. Now let's look at each of these flours a little bit more in depth. All-purpose flour is the staple among staples. It's the most versatile of all flours. If you have a recipe that says 1 cup of flour, they mean all-purpose. All-purpose flour has a protein content of 10 to 12%, and this produces a really nice chewy bread. Bread flour has the strongest protein content of 12 to sometimes 16%, and it's the strongest of all flours. It's important to use bread flour when making a yeasted bread. It gives the bread more volume. It also produces a really nice chewy crumb, and it is better for browning. Whole wheat flour and white whole wheat flour have a pretty high protein content of about 15 to 16%. This type of flour, when used on its own, will produce a heavier, denser type of bread. It's a sweeter flour, so what I usually do is I'll substitute some whole wheat or white whole wheat flour in with my bread flour. Let's talk about measuring our flour. The only thing I could say when measuring your flour is you need to do it carefully. If you have too much flour, the end result will be a dry, dense loaf of bread. If you have too little flour, your dough is just going to spread out and it's not going to rise. The best way to measure is by using a kitchen scale. Here's my scale. I've had it for years. I think I got it off of Amazon. And I'm going to turn it on. And when measuring flour for bread, you want it set to grams. We're going to be measuring in grams. I don't know if you can see that there in the corner. So I'm taking my measuring cup and I'm going to put it on the scale. You'll notice that the gram amount goes up. We want to take that away. We want to start with a 0 weight. This is called the tare. So I'm going to press this and it brings the scale to 0. So I'm only going to be measuring the flour here, not the weight of the cup as well. 1 cup of flour is the equivalent of 120 grams. So we're just going to keep putting flour in, this is bread flour, until it reaches 120 grams. Okay, I've gone over. This is 140 grams. So I'm going to spoon some out. 132, 127, let's just take a little bit more out. 25. So it is a process. $119. There we go. Okay, 119. There, 120 grams. Now what happens if you don't have a scale? Use your measuring cup, and we're going to do a method called spoon in and level. We're going to take our flour. This is going to get messy. And you're going to spoon it into your measuring cup. Like this. You're not going to pack it down at all. You're just going to put it in here till it reaches the top. All right, there we go. And then all you're going to do is with the back of a knife, you're just going to level it like that. This is about as close as you're going to get to about 120 grams of flour. Now I need to clean this flour up. So my suggestion is spend the extra dollars, get a measuring scale. It's really the most accurate way to measure your flour. Now let's get on to kneading. Do I knead by hand or do I knead with the dough hook and a stand mixer? I think it's personal preference. The dough hook in a stand mixer actually makes it easier for you because it's doing all the work. Kneading by hand takes a little bit of elbow grease on your part, usually a good 10 to 15 minutes of kneading the dough. So how do you know when your dough is ready to rise? There are 2 ways to test to see if your dough is ready for its first rise. One is poking it with your finger, and the other way is the window pane test. I use both methods. If you poke your dough with your finger and it springs back slowly, then your bread is ready for its first rise. If you poke it and it comes back right away, it's not ready and it needs more kneading. The window pane method. You're going to take about a golf-sized amount of dough and you're going to pull it apart. When you pull it apart, if it breaks immediately, it's not ready and it needs kneading. If you can stretch it apart and you can actually see through it, then it's ready for its first rise. Now let's move on to rising, or proofing as it's called, proofing the dough. When your dough is ready, after you've done either the window pane test or the finger poking test or both, you want to transfer your dough to a lightly greased bowl. Cover it with plastic wrap or you can cover it with a towel. Let the dough rise till it's doubled in size. This is called the first rise. When this is complete, you want to gently deflate your dough, reshape it, put it back in the bowl, and let it rise again. This is the second rise. The second rise is important because it redistributes the yeast, gives the dough a more even rise, and it gives the bread a better flavor. Let's move on to our last essential, baking the bread. Baking plays a big factor in how your bread is going to turn out. I suggest you follow exactly what your recipe calls for when baking the bread. So if you want a crusty, crunchy bread, you're going to bake your bread for a shorter amount of time at a higher temperature of about 425 degrees and above. For a softer, tender bread, you're going to bake it for a longer period of time, but at a lower temperature, usually about 375 degrees. Okay, so there you have it, the 6 essentials that I wanted to talk about before we actually get into bread making. Well, thanks for watching, everyone. Be on the lookout for my next video, which is going to be how to make French bread. Have a great day, and I'll see you soon.